We're going to be preaching today on the person of Joseph. Not the Joseph who had problems with his brothers and ended up having to forgive them. I preached on that the last time I preached. No, I'm going to preach on the other Joseph. No, not that Joseph that's the stepfather of Jesus. The other Joseph. You know, the Joseph that's mentioned 28 times in the New Testament? That's the Joseph I want to preach on this morning. Turn with me to Acts chapter 4, and we're going to begin looking this morning in verse number 36. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 36, it says to us, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. Well, Barnabas is one of those characters, and the reason I kind of opened the sermon the way I did, that he's one of those guys that's like present at all the key moments, but you kind of forget he's there. Like the guy that shows up in all the group photos, and you kind of keep trying to, what's his name again? But he plays a key role behind the scenes, interwoven into the narrative of the New Testament, because he lives up to his nickname, which is son of encouragement. Now let's just imagine this morning that the people in this room who know you, right? Joseph got his nickname from the people who are other Christians he's doing life with. So what would the people who are believers, whom you are doing life with right now, what nickname would they give you if they were going to give you a nickname? Some of you know that in past years, at graduation time, we used to actually give nicknames. Dr. Gallagher was the master of ceremonies of that, and we'd give nicknames to various seniors as they were graduating. What would you be known as? Would you be known as the Prince of Preachers, as the brilliant theologian, or the warrior of video games? Think about, what would people call you? As a young minister, I was 21 years old when I first started pastoring a church. Fresh out of Bible college, and went to this little church in Cleveland, Ohio, and it turns out that it was really the people that were there were West Virginia transplants who had left West Virginia in search of jobs and gone to the factories to work in Cleveland. And I was now pastoring this church. It was called Friendship, but it didn't really live up to its name. There were 6 people in this church. And as difficult as it is to imagine shrinking a church that size, I found a way to do it. I came in with all the answers. I got my degree. I've been on academic, dean's list all the way through college. And I had my briefcase back in those days. That meant you're someone important. I came into my office dressed up in my suit on a Monday, and there's nobody else around in a church that small. I thought I had all the answers. And I had some of the arrogance to go with it. And I managed to start one by one, offend, upset, not understand people who had been in that church for years. And I actually found myself one day preaching to 2 people. One of the people was sitting there. She played the piano. Her name was Sister Cook. And she was also from West Virginia. And she watched as one by one her lifelong friends from that church gave up on that young preacher. And a time when I felt alone, I felt frustrated, I felt like, am I even really called? She continued to play the piano for me. Now, she played a honky-tonk style. If you know anything about West Virginia, it had this kind of honky-tonk sound to it. And I was leading worship because when there's only 2 people in attendance, and I can't sing worth a lick, it was absolutely It would have hurt your ears if you'd been there to hear it. It was a joyful noise with the emphasis on the word noise. But I always remember her staying faithfully for the whole 4 years that I pastored that church. She always had encouraging words for me. And just her presence meant so much. When everyone else had walked out, she stayed. I stand before you this morning, not because of simply my own efforts. Yes, it's the grace of God that I stand before you, but also the grace of God sometimes mitigated through the sister cooks. You are here this morning because you have a sister cook in your life. It may have been a family member or a friend or a mentor or a youth pastor who reached you with the gospel. You are here this morning, and chances are there's any number of people who have played that role in our lives. We do the things we do, not because of our own efforts and our own abilities, but it's really the composite of all the words of encouragement and the touches of encouragement and the presence of encouragement that we have received from those God kept in our lives, when in all rights they should have probably walked out on us. Some of you are here this morning because of other people in this room. Because of a midnight conversation in a dorm room that took place, or a whispered conversation in a prayer meeting where someone spoke words of encouragement into your heart. It was said of Job, his words kept men on their feet. I was arrested last week when I was listening to the sermons being preached on Wednesday, the 5 for 5 minute sermons, and Corey got up and he started talking about Barnabas, and I'm sitting over here going, oh no, he's going to ruin my sermon. Oh no, and then I thought, no, he only has 5 minutes. Corey can't ruin it in 5 minutes. But there's something he said in his sermon that really arrested me. And that is, he said, he challenged us to be a Barnabas generation. So that's my homiletical idea for today. Thank you, Corey, for giving me my homiletical idea. So Corey Crabtree is preaching this morning, right? Let us be a Barnabas generation. With all the words that are spoken, all the things that some of you have heard because you're around friends and family members who may not be Christians, or the things you see in social media, the put-downs, the criticism, the cynicism, we desperately need today to be a Barnabas generation. Looking further at our passage, we see the first thing that's necessary to have in our lives that is true of Joseph or Barnabas in this passage. And in order to be a Barnabas generation, we need to do what verse 37 tells us the son of encouragement Barnabas did. It says he sold a field. Now, this doesn't mean you have to go sell your house. I'm assuming most of you are not homeowners yet. Is that correct? Right? But he sold a field that he owned, and he brought the money and he put it at the apostles' feet. He was generous-hearted. If we are going to meet the needs of others, and when you encourage people, one of the ways you encourage them is through the practical and the practice of being generous and meeting other people's needs. And Barnabas knew how to do that. James tells us it does you little good to say, God bless you to someone who's hungry or they're cold, and say, be well fed and take it. We're just saying those words for their own benefit, not helping anyone else. Barnabas saw a need in this church in Jerusalem. He saw the believers gathering together, wanting daily to be in the teaching of the apostles. It makes me think that some of these people are probably people who had traveled from distant places throughout the Mediterranean world to be present at Passover and then stayed over the 50 days so they could celebrate Pentecost, and they had gotten converted when they heard the preaching of Peter on the day of Pentecost. And some of them are perhaps trying to stay on in the city beyond what their financial needs and capacity would otherwise permit. And they're trying to get intensive discipleship to prepare them, to grow them, because they want to be a part of this new Israel, the kingdom of God, and understand who Jesus Christ is. And he comes and he lays his money at the feet of the apostles so that there would be no one among them, Luke says, that would have any needs. Now, we don't know who all may have been present. We don't know what all they may have done. So, yeah, there's a little bit of supposition involved, but I can imagine some of them would have gone back to places like Rome, because we know there were believers present from Rome on the day of Pentecost, or there were Jews present from Rome on the day of Pentecost, and may well have been the very ones who established the church there. Because we know it wasn't Peter or Paul or any of the other apostles. We really don't know the names, but the church in Rome is perhaps one of the most historic and significant churches. Or other places throughout the Mediterranean world where they would go back home, where they probably were leaders and influencers, and they would begin to establish churches, but they needed to be discipled in the season in their life. And Barnabas is used by God to meet a need in other people's lives, because that's how we encourage others, is by being generous-hearted. Now, that's rather living differently than the world in which we currently exist, because the world we live in says your value is dependent on how much money you have, the kind of car you drive, the kind of home you live in, the clothes you wear, all the rest of those kinds of things. They chase after them, they worry about it, they stress out over it. And Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 6, in verse number 19, he's talking to a group of Galilean peasants in what we know was called the Sermon on the Mount. And he's saying to them, you have a choice. Now, what's happening to them is many of them are losing their ancestral homelands. The wealthy from Judea are coming up and buying up the land, and they are then turning those who previously had owned the land into tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Many of them are suffering under the Herod's rule, and then on top of that, the rule of Rome and all the taxes that have to be paid, and they are struggling. They don't have a lot. And they've been told all their lives because they're poor and they're nobodies. Everybody else gets to decide for you. You don't really have a choice in this. It's all rigged. It's all against you. And Jesus looks at him and says, you have a choice. You could choose what you're going to do with your treasures. Everybody has something that's of value. You can store it up in heaven, kingdom, or you can store it up in earth. But you have a choice. And the choice you make will determine what happens to your heart. Because where your treasure is, there your heart is also. In fact, if you allow the desire to hold on to things, if you begin to buy into the rhetoric of a materialistic world, a selfish world, if you buy into that thinking, what will happen is the light within you will become darkness, and then how great will be the darkness? In fact, what he tells them is that based on your choice, I can tell you what your future looks like. Because ultimately, you get to verse 24, he says, I can tell you who's going to be in control of your life based on the choice you're making right now with the little you have. You see, we do not become who we want to become. We become who we choose to become. The heart gets pulled along by the choice. It ends up with a choice. We all become exactly who we choose to be. We want to be one thing, but Jesus is saying your choices right now are going to determine your character and therefore your future. And in this world in which you're living, you will never defeat worry about money until you decide God really is in control and start living like that's true. And that means you become generous-hearted now. You have a choice. Begin to practice it now, because when we become generous-hearted people, we'll begin to catch on to the spirit of Barnabas, and we begin to meet the needs of others. We begin to encourage others. God will provide for us. Our president reminds us over and over again that God will do for you what you're willing to do for others. But may we be a Barnabas generation. And a Barnabas generation is a generation that is generous-hearted in meeting the needs, the practical needs of others. I used to get two kinds of letters when I was a college student. My mother was the women's ministry director for the state of Ohio, and so she had pink envelopes. My father was the district superintendent in Ohio. He had blue envelopes. When I got the blue envelopes, it was wonderful because my dad was sending me a message and it was always encouraging, and I'd read it. But when those pink envelopes showed up, how many of you know there was something besides just words in those pink envelopes? Right? There was a check in there. That's real encouragement, right? And that's the kind of people we need to be. People who are generous-hearted people, and you're deciding right now, you become. In time, we always become our choices. The second thing we need to understand about being a Barnabas generation is that we need to see the best about people. In Acts chapter 9 is the next place where we encounter Barnabas in our story. The 9th chapter of Acts, the early part of that chapter, Saul experiences his conversion calling, converting to Jesus as Messiah, and his calling as an apostle to the Gentiles on the road to Damascus. And then by the time we get down to the place where we're going to be looking at, starting in verse number 26, Saul has decided now to return back to Jerusalem. But there is, of course, a problem because just a little over 3 years earlier, Saul had been persecuting the Christians in that city. Saul had stopped by some of these people's homes and arrested them. They are now orphans and widows in this congregation. Their lives have been altered for the rest of their lives. It's not the kind of thing that someone said something mean and then you got to forgive them. This is something he has made choices in persecuting these believers that has left them scarred and hurting, and they are not ready to receive him again. And so we pick up in verse number 26, when he came, he meaning Saul, to Jerusalem. He tried to join the disciples. Hey guys, it's me. Oh yeah, we recognize you. We recognize that angry face, the knock at midnight of the soldiers 3.5 years ago. But they were all afraid of him. They didn't believe he was really a disciple. You're still who you've always been. You can't have been that bad and changed that quickly. They held his past against him. If we're going to be a Barnabas generation, once again, we're going to have to see people, see the best in people, and that means we're going to have to be different than the world in which we live. We live in a world that is cynical. We live in a world that wants to find fault with everyone. We live in a world where if you said something or posted something 10 years ago, it's going to be held against you forever. We live in a world where people are ready to counsel someone else because they didn't say the right things or they didn't go to the right place. Where there's all law and rule and no grace and no cross. And he's looking, Barnabas is looking, and we don't know if Barnabas was ever personally affected. by the decisions of Saul and the persecution. But he's looking in the face of a man, and he decides to do something that other people are not doing. He decides to actually listen to what he has to say instead of just pulling away. Too often people get saved out of a life of the world, and they don't belong there comfortably anymore because now Jesus is ruling in their hearts, and they want to follow after him, and they try to go to church, and if we're not careful, they may find themselves being rejected because they don't look enough like we do or don't act enough like we do. And they find themselves no longer belonging in the old world and no longer belonging in the new world they want to join, and they don't know where they belong. We lose an awful lot of Sauls, therefore Pauls. I wonder how many books the New Testament have if there wasn't a Barnabas. And Barnabas does something other people aren't doing. They're listening to their fear. They're letting the memory define who someone is. They're treating them like they're still who they were. I was asking somebody who wants to forgive me, and they said, "I forgive you." I said, "Well, your words are telling me I'm forgiven. The sound of your voice, however, is causing doubt." Right? I mean, and so he sits down and he listens to him. He hears his story. He finds out about what happened on the road to Damascus. He hears about a calling to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so what Barnabas does in verse 27 is he took him and brought him to the apostles. Like, "Come with me." Puts his arm around him. This is encourager. They're present at all the key moments. They just seem to always show up when you need them. He says, "Come with me," and he puts that big burly arm of his around Saul and says, "Come on, I'll introduce you to the apostles." And he told them how Saul on his journey. That's how we know he listened to Saul, because you can't tell the story if you didn't listen to the person tell it to you in the first place. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So Saul stays where? With them. Probably most commentators said the first place he would have stayed would have been with Barnabas. I mean, I think 3.5 years earlier, if Saul had known where Barnabas was living, there would have been a knock on the door for a very different reason. Now he's staying with them. But the word "them" is more than Barnabas. It means the apostles. It means James. It means John. It means Peter. It means the others who are present there are starting to open up their lives and their homes, and they're allowing him to become a part of the fellowship. They're beginning to see him the way Barnabas saw him, through the grace and the forgiveness, seeing the best in someone and not just assuming they are who they always were. It says then that so Saul stayed with them in verse 28 and moved about freely in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. So someone who is going to be a part of the Barnabas generation needs to be generous-hearted to meet the needs of others. But they need to see the best in others. In Acts chapter 11, we encounter the name of Barnabas once again. In Acts chapter 11 describes the growing church in the city of Antioch. And the believers, as they're coming in, they need to be discipled because it's different than the church in Jerusalem. Most of them are coming from a Gentile background. Whereas in Jerusalem, people had come from a Jewish background into the faith. And it means there's whole new barriers or issues that have to be dealt with in discipleship. For instance, if someone is coming from a Greek background, Greeks they never cheat on their wives. They just sleep with all kinds of women. You might say, how is that possible? Because they don't think it's cheating. They never promised to be faithful to them. The wife is there to have children. They're going to meet their physical needs however they see fit. They'll take care of them. They want a legitimate offspring. Make sure she's faithful. You're taking people so that Paul has to actually say to them, like, you know that thing about going and visiting the temple prostitutes and coming in here and celebrating the Lord's Supper with us? We need to cut that out. Right? I know you used to think you were religious when you were doing that, but that's not going to work anymore. I mean, you can imagine the issues that Barnabas would have to deal with all these Gentiles who are coming in. They're coming in with a background of sexual immorality and a background of idolatry that is not true of Jewish converts who already understand that. But Jews are unique in the ancient world. They don't even have a concept of sin yet until they come to faith. And so the church in Jerusalem was a little worried. What kind of a church is this going to be if all of these Gentiles are coming in and they're going to be converted there in Antioch? And so they decide they're going to send someone up to them. And so in Acts chapter 11 and verse 22, news of this reached the church in Jerusalem. That is news about the church in Antioch. And they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived, he saw what the grace of God had done, and he was glad and encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. And he's not just simply telling them, let's have a good time and your life's going to be a lot better. He's saying, you need to be true to God with all of your heart. No doubt there's some correction. But whenever you want to encourage someone, you believe the best in someone else, it means sometimes you've got to say some things to them that there's areas where they need to change. They need to be corrected in. Some people are just really gifted at this. My wife, she has a way of correcting people. I tell her, Laura Lee, you could read someone the riot act and they'd walk away saying what a good friend they have in Laura Lee. Like, you just have an ability to be able to do that. And I think that's what he's doing, is because whatever correction he brings to them, it's laced with grace and redemption, because they're starting to grow and they're starting to prosper in the Lord. They're responding to that. And so it tells us that he was a good man in verse 24, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. As he's looking around, and by the way, we know he's doing a great job of discipling these believers, because it's here at Antioch that they are first called Christians. It means when people looked at those who were the disciples of Barnabas, they didn't call them Barnabites. Right? They said, when we look at these people who once had been caught up in pagan living, when we look at these people, what word would come to our mind? What nickname could we give them that would represent what we see? And they say, we see Jesus. We see Christ. So they start calling them Christians. It's the first time. They've been called the Way, or had other names for those who were followers previously. But there at Antioch, they say, we see Christ. So the work is going forward, but it's kind of overwhelming for Barnabas, because all these people coming in and all the discipleship issues that have to be dealt with, and growing this church and growing these believers who are Gentiles coming into the faith. And he remembers a conversation he'd had earlier with someone who told him he was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. It's been almost 9 years, maybe 9.5 years, since the last time the two men had conversed. He discovers the whereabouts of Saul, and Saul, after preaching in Jerusalem, had gone back to his hometown of Tarsus, and he spends what scholars simply call the 9 silent years. We're not really sure what all he's doing, but we know if he's involved in ministry, which undoubtedly he would be because of his calling upon his life, there is no fruit that is evident. There's no church that is founded. He never describes any of his family members, that being his hometown, ever getting converted. And I can well imagine him going back to doing the thing he needs to do in order to be able to survive, which, in the end, Paul, like all the rest of us, likes to eat. So he's probably tent making, and he's working away one day there in Tarsus, probably wondering whatever happened to the calling on his life, and this incredible beginning and this remarkable transformation. And then all of a sudden, for 9 years, it's like he's been sitting on the shelf. He's now well into his 40s, well past middle age by the standards of the ancient world, and he's still not gained any traction in ministry to really getting around to doing the very thing he'd been called to do. And he looks up one day, and he sees Barnabas and his smiling face. This big burly guy with these big arms ready to wrap him around Saul. Come here. I've been praying, and Lord put you on my heart. I got a word of encouragement for you. I got a place in ministry that I think has your name written all over it. We are overwhelmed with the number of disciples we have, and we need someone who is steeped in the Word and knows the Scriptures and yet has a passion for reaching Gentiles. And I think of you. Some of you may one day make a phone call to a friend who's sitting in this room right now who's been selling insurance and open a door back into ministry for them where they really belong. He says, you got to come. You got to help me. And for a whole year, the two men just served side by side in this fruitful ministry of this growing and dynamic church at Antioch. All because Barnabas is an encourager. He believes the best. He sees the best in others. The first missionary journey is going to take place when the Spirit moves upon congregants at that church in Antioch, and they lay hands on Barnabas and Saul. And the names are given in that sequence because Barnabas is clearly the leader. He's really been the mentor. He's been the guy who's opened all the doors for Saul in terms of ministry. And they're going to send them off on that first missionary journey. And as they're on that first missionary journey, they go to Cyprus, which is, of course, where Joseph or Barnabas is from. And there they have an encounter with a magician in which that man is blinded. But there's a shift that takes place in the sequencing of the names. And as you probably well know, the name that comes first in the ancient world is always going to be the one that will be regarded as the leader. And this missionary team goes from being Barnabas and Saul to being Saul, or more specifically Paul, as he now identifies with his Roman name and his Gentile ministry. Paul and Barnabas. It will eventually become Paul and his traveling companions. And Joseph or Barnabas will kind of fade into the background. The third characteristic that we have to have if we're going to be a Barnabas generation is humility. Humility that enables us to serve others so they can succeed. Humility that's willing to step back in that moment when we would only get in the way of what God is doing in someone else's life by trying to compete for a title or a position with someone else. Now, once again, we live in a world that thinks the exact opposite. It's all about self-fulfillment. It's all about me. It's all about what's going to please me and make me happy. And we live in that kind of world, and we can get caught up in that kind of thinking, but that will prevent us from being a Barnabas generation and practicing the humility that says, no, I want to be able to focus on others. Listen, God has transformed your life at the cross. He loves you. That's the message of the gospel. And when you understand the gospel, it frees you from needing other people's approval because you have God's approval. You are loved. So now you can focus on other people. Until the gospel is a reality in your life, you're forever trying to focus on how you can get ahead and impress other people. But when the gospel is not just understood, we all understand it, you live like you're loved by God. You stop focusing on yourself. Why do you need to do that? God's saying, I've already focused on you. I went to the cross. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to do everything for you need. You don't have to. That's how the world lives. You don't have to live that way. You can focus on others. You can practice humility. Because that's what's going to enable you to encourage people you otherwise will compete with and get in the way of. Mark didn't understand it. Mark quit. Mark was the relative, the younger relative of Barnabas who had been on the missionary journey, and perhaps it was too much for him to watch as his relative, this man who has been such a leader in the church in Jerusalem and everywhere else in Antioch, suddenly, in his mind, perhaps being upstaged by this Saul, now guy calling himself Paul. So he quits. Maybe it was just too arduous, the whole missionary experience. We don't know exactly why, but Mark goes back to Jerusalem, and Paul is desperate to find out what he's going to say because he could report all kinds of negative things about that missionary journey to the people in Jerusalem. And the two missionaries head on, and they continue to go on that first missionary journey in the areas of Galatia, and they end up at a place called Lystra, where the people are thinking, because they're so backwards, they're out in the countryside, people think they are Greek gods come to visit them. There was a legend that Greek gods would show up and visit them, and they see the miracles that are happening, and they just start to say to themselves, oh, that's who Barnabas and Paul are. And Barnabas gets confused with Zeus. Now, Zeus is the head of the Greek pantheon. This is a powerful god. So it makes me think Barnabas is a big guy. Probably a big, bearded, strong individual. Looks like Zeus. And then they said, oh, we know who Paul is. He's Hermes. Hermes is a little tiny winged messenger god. Right? So he's probably short. And I'm not putting him down because I like short people. Right? But he's probably short by comparison next to Barnabas, right? And when the people in Lystra realize that these are not really gods after all, you're like, no. They do a complete reversal. It's a 180 turnaround, and the next thing you know, they're stoning them, particularly Paul. He always seems to get people mad wherever he goes. And they leave him for dead. And he's laying there, covered in mud and dust, rocks and blood. Every part of his body probably hurting. And whose smiling face does he see? A son of encouragement. They just always show up at the right time. Barnabas probably reaches down there and helps him to kind of get straightened up a little bit and cleaned up a little bit. And the two of them are going to go off to the next town to continue evangelism. And no doubt Paul is leaning up against the big burly arms of Barnabas as he limps off to the next place of ministry. He's a son of encouragement. When they get back to Antioch after this missionary journey, Paul is going to be dismayed. He's going to be dismayed because Peter has showed up, and that's not the reason he's dismayed, because when Peter first comes to Antioch, he's sitting in the cafeteria. I'm assuming they have a cafeteria. And he's eating at the meals with the Gentiles. And Peter, no doubt, is talking about how, boy, when he was at Cornelius' house, God had opened his eyes and gave him a vision and told him to call nothing unclean, and how the Spirit had been poured out on a Gentile. And yeah, man, and he's sitting there and he's fellowshipping with him until some people from Jerusalem show up. And when the people from Jerusalem show up, they're people who are going to be a lot more interested in maintaining. They believe in Jesus, but they want to maintain the law, the circumcision, other things. They're arguing, yes, Gentiles can be saved, but they have to become Jews in order to be saved. And all of a sudden, Peter has a choice to make as to who he's going to sit with, because these Christians, Jewish Christians from Jerusalem, apparently sent by James, at least that's what they're claiming, are not eating with the Gentile Christians. They want kosher-only meals. And all of a sudden, Peter stops eating with the Gentiles, starts hanging out with the Jewish Christians. Now, I don't think Peter changed his theology. Because what we find out right after this is he's going to go to Jerusalem, and there's going to be a council recorded in the 15th chapter of Acts, in which Peter's going to get up and testify about what happened at Cornelius' house, and everyone's going to fall silent, and he's going to say people can come into the faith, Gentiles as they are. His theology did not change. His behavior changed. And that's really what Paul's criticizing. You used to eat with them, and now you don't because they showed up. You're trying to impress them. And I tell you all this not to talk about the conflict that comes in, the confrontation that happens at Antioch between Paul and Peter, but because of the words that then Paul writes in Galatians about the situation. And we read them in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 13. The other Jews joined him, meaning Peter, in his hypocrisy. So that by their hypocrisy, and here's the words that are almost hard to read, even Barnabas. That Barnabas, he stood next to me and preached the whole first missionary journey. This is the guy I leaned up against when I was left for dead. I get the word even. I think it just almost drips with emotion and passion and hurt, disappointment. And Paul, as he writes that word, even Barnabas was led astray. I read some books about different characters of the New Testament, and they would have sections in these books about Barnabas, and no one mentions this. I thought about leaving it out of the sermon. In fact, I preached a similar sermon at church and didn't talk about it. But I think we need to think about what happens here. Because sometimes good people, godly people, faithful people mess up. They stumble. We don't know exactly what's going on in the mind of Barnabas, but I don't think Barnabas changed his theology any more than Peter did. Because Barnabas is also going to go to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15. And Barnabas, like Peter, is also going to testify about the Gentiles coming to faith. No, his behavior just no longer matched his theology. Because apparently Barnabas had, in a moment of weakness, wanted to impress the right people. And in ministry, there will come a day, almost undoubtedly, when you will want to impress the right people. People who can help you to get ahead, open doors. The people you've always kind of looked up to or admired, or they're just your close buddies and you don't want to disappoint these people. Because, well, Peter, he had laid the money at Peter's feet in Acts chapter 4. This is a man Barnabas clearly looks up to, and he doesn't really want to have a break with him. He forgot to be humble. He forgot the humility of putting others first. And I can just imagine the Gentiles sitting there watching him. The man who had discipled them. The man who had taught them all those truths. The man who had looked in their eyes and time again told them how much he believed in them. How much he loved them. Now, he won't even eat with them anymore. Because he's trying to impress the right crowd. My junior year in Bible college, I had gotten into Greek. Mostly because my friend challenged me to get into Greek and then said something like, you probably aren't smart enough to do it. So that was it. Now I had to get an A. All the rest of that stuff. Like, don't say stuff like that to me. Yeah, you're talking about Crabtree. I can do this. So I'm studying away and I'm getting, I'm working on my grades. You always have people that you're trying to impress. It could be people at the school or mom and dad and everybody else. And we're so proud of you when you get those really good grades. And I'm working away at this stuff. And one day, someone comes in my room. And he says to me, Bob's ready to leave. I said, well, where's he going? He's quitting school. You have to understand, Bob Titus was my roommate. And I didn't even know. I had to run out to the curb so I could wave goodbye. I got Dean's List again. I did all the right stuff. Everybody was impressed. I think I won some academic awards, which I have no idea if I'm confusing it with another semester or those are gone. Who knows where I would have put that stuff. But I spent the rest of that semester in a room with an empty bed. And I don't know what he's doing today. Because there comes moments in our lives we fully intend to be Barnabases. I know you do. I know there's people in this room because of your words and because of your actions and your choices. And there's other people in the room because of what you've done and how they've helped. We've helped each other. We're here not on our own. We're here because there's Barnabases in our lives, and there's probably a bunch of them. But every once in a while, we get so caught up in doing our thing that we can lose sight of just Barnabas being Barnabas. Doing the thing he's all about. One more passage. Acts chapter 15 and verse number 39. Acts chapter 15, as I've said, describes the Council of Jerusalem in which Paul and Barnabas had attended together and stood by side and ministered together. And they're encouraging the church to experience unity. You do not want division over the Jew-Gentile issue. That is not the gospel. That is Christ's death on the cross broke down the wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. And so it is so important after they wrestled their way through all the issues and finally came to a decision that says, Gentiles can come as they are. And the unity has been preserved in the church, and it's just a big sigh of relief. The two men get ready to head off into ministry again, the end of that very same chapter, and they fall into a horrible disagreement. After having preached unity to others, they really get into it with each other. A heated argument. Words would have been spoken that would have hurt and stung in frustration. Two men who had spent years side by side depended on each other for all those times and those missionary journeys and all those times they had taught together and everything they'd been together, and now they're going at it. And why are these two men losing their cool, basically, and going at it with each other? It has to do with Mark. Barnabas thinks Mark deserves a second chance because Barnabas is Barnabas again. He can't help himself. He still believes the best in others. He sees it in them. And he wants to bring them along. And Paul's like, no way. He doesn't got what it takes. We can find some other young minister. We'll mentor him instead. I can imagine Barnabas shooting back. Paul, I believed in you when no one else did. When they didn't want anything to do with you in Jerusalem, I listened to what you had to say, and I brought you in and let you stay with me, and I showed you around, and you met people. I came to Tarsus when your life and ministry was on the shelf, and I brought you back into ministry in Antioch. I watched you upstage me as a leader because I understood you had gifts beyond mine. I hugged you when you'd been left for dead. Stood beside you. This man deserves another chance. You've got it wrong. Surely Barnabas would want to impress Paul. They have a deep friendship with each other. But Barnabas can't let go of the fact he's going to encourage an otherwise discouraged young minister. And so it says they had such a sharp disagreement, that they parted company, talking about Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. And when they did that, he sailed out of the pages of the New Testament. He sailed out of the pages of history. But the last sight we catch of Barnabas, he's back to being Barnabas again. He's got Mark with him. He's going to help Mark when Mark gets frustrated and sometimes feels like he can't do it or he's not going to be good enough. And how can he overcome his failure? If people like Paul are going to hold this against me, how can I go forward? And he's got the best man possible next to him. I said earlier, I wonder sometimes how much of the New Testament are you missing because of Paul's letters if there wasn't a Barnabas. And as I was preparing this sermon, I thought to myself, would we have the gospel of Mark if the two of them hadn't sailed off together? I mean, later on, Paul's going to say, bring Mark to me because he's useful in ministry, and I think that's about as close as that man's going to get to an apology. I think Paul got it right at Antioch about not eating with Gentiles, but I think Barnabas gets it right about Mark. He's back to being who he's been called to be. You're called to be this part of this, challenging to be a part of this Barnabas generation. And I think all of you want to be Barnabases because you know the difference others have made in your life. In order to do this, we have to be generous-hearted so we can meet the needs of others. In order to do this, we have to see the best in others. In order to do this, we have the humility to put others first. We have to reject the materialism of our world. We have to reject the cynicism of our world. We have to reject the selfishness of our world so we can be a part of the Barnabas generation. And this morning, some of you have kind of lost your way a little bit. And there's some people, maybe you don't eat with them, whatever. You've gotten distracted. There's people you're trying to impress. My challenge to you this morning is, let's go back to being the Barnabas you're called to be. Let's get back to that.